All right, everyone, we're going to be starting chapter 4, which is on sensation and perception. The first two-thirds of this chapter is on sensation, and we're going to be talking a lot about the different organs that we have within our body that allow us to sense things in our environment. And then the last part of this chapter is on perception, so how our brain actually organizes this information that's come in from our sensory organs and arranges it in a way that makes sense to us. So let's get started. So I want you to think, first of all, what you're sensing right now. So what can you see? So look around your environment. Maybe notice some things you otherwise wouldn't have normally noticed. What can you hear? Even if you're in a really quiet room, you're probably hearing some sort of noise, whether it's traffic outside, the wind, it could be your AC unit, people talking maybe down the hall or in another room. You can almost always hear something. What are you smelling? Maybe you have some perfume on or lotion. Maybe there's some cleaning products that you're smelling. Perhaps it could be something that you recently ate that you're still the scent is still kind of lingering near you. What are you tasting? Are you eating or drinking something right now? Or did you recently eat or drink something? Maybe it's your toothpaste. Maybe it's just like the taste of your saliva, which probably now seems really gross. But you probably have some sort of taste in your mouth. What are you touching? What are you touching as far as your hands? Typically, what we think of with touch is our hands, but your arms, your back, your butt, your feet. What are they touching? So if you're sitting down right now, you're probably feeling the pressure of the seat on your butt cheeks. And you probably didn't notice that until I brought attention to that. Proprioception, you probably have never heard of this before, but essentially it's your body within space. So where are your limbs in relation to your body, your core? Are your hands above your feet? Your hands above your head, or are they below your head? All these different things, like where you are within the environment, is proprioception. That's what allows you to close your eyes and touch your finger to the tip of your nose. That is your sense of space. Even without seeing what your body is doing, you can still sense where it is. And pain. Now, this doesn't have to be sharp pain, but it could be maybe some mild irritation. It could be, a pinching in your shoes because your shoes aren't fitting really well. It could be a scratchy tag. It could be, achy limbs from a workout. So what kind of pain are you possibly feeling? What about temperature, heat? Are you warm? Are you cold? Are you feeling chilled? Or, are you kind of in a nice temperature space right now? So we're going to be talking about essentially each of the ways that our body can detect these different sensations in the first part of this chapter. So we're going to be, again, studying the concepts of sensation and perception. So part 1 is sensation. So transducers, these are any devices that convert one type of energy into another. And that's the main function of our sensory organs. We actually can call our sensory organs transducers. So your eyes, ears, mouth, nose, your skin, these are all transducers. And they each take a different type of physical energy specific to that organ, and it translates it into activity within our nervous system, action potentials, as we've talked about in chapter 2. So sensations are considered sensory impressions, and it's also the process of detecting physical energies with your sensory organs. So light energy is detected by your eyes. Chemicals are detected by your nose and your mouth. Perception, on the other hand, is your mental process of organizing sensations into meaningful patterns. So without perception, your sensations aren't going to make any sense. And you might actually ignore wide swaths of your sensations, which is actually what our brains do quite a bit. But making sense of all the information that's come into us is perception, which is a separate kind of discussion than sensation. We're going to get to that later on in this chapter. So how do we navigate the world? Again, we have sensation, which is receiving signals from the environment, and perception is organizing and interpreting these signals. But sometimes we don't immediately perceive what we sense. So if you see this picture on the right, you probably first first kind of out of the corner of your eye glance saw a leaf. But when you really looked at this image, you saw that there was a snake there. Um, and camouflage is kind of tricking our perception. We can sense what's physically there. Our eyes are picking up the light waves off this image, but perception hasn't organized it in a way for us to perceive what could be possibly a threat to us. So we have to have both parts working in tandem. So, psychophysics is actually a specific subsection of psychology that looks at how these physical energies are detected and organized and perceived by humans and other animals. So, we see information or we get information from different types of energy, like I mentioned. We have light waves, sound waves, chemicals, and temperature. And psychophysics is the area of study of how this energy is measured and how it's related to different aspects of our sensory experience. So, brightness could be the intensity or amplitude of the wave when it's a light wave, loudness as well. So, psychophysics actually looks to see how our brains actually take in this information, interprets it. But sometimes we sense things and we're not perceiving it. Like we said in the last picture, we will see like a snake is, the light waves are coming to our eye whether we perceive it or not, but we may not have noticed it at first. We actually have to interpret it more thoroughly, but then once you perceive that snake there, the image has actually changed. It kind of pops out. If you've ever seen camouflage like an octopus or a moth on bark, you don't notice it's there, and then once you do, you're like, oh wow, and you can't kind of not see it at that point. So here's an overall kind of flow chart of sensation to perception. So some information, some energy in the world happens. So for example, hitting one of those little like hotel bells, that ding, there's sound waves kind of moving throughout the environment. You have a structure on your body that will take that energy and possibly modify it. In this case, it'd be your ear. So your ear is going to funnel that into your ear canal. Then inside your ear, there's a place where that energy turns into a neural response. We're going to talk about that a lot when we get to our auditory section. Then those sensory nerves transfer that coded information into your brain, your central nervous system. It gets processed first by your thalamus, and then it will relay the neural response to the part of the brain responsible for that type of energy, which in this case is your primary auditory cortex and your temporal lobe. And then the cerebral cortex will receive that input and then produce your sensation and perception. So it'll be like, oh, a bell rang, and a bell rang, which means I have to answer someone at the front desk. So that's like this long process. Now, and it looks really long. It's multiple steps, but it actually takes just a fraction of a second, a couple milliseconds for that energy to have been produced and your body to actually respond to that and recognize that you need to respond to that. It's a very, very rapid process, which is very impressive that our brain can handle this type of response continuously throughout our lives every single day, many, many times a day. It's quite impressive. Absolute thresholds is a really interesting area of sensation research, and this is our understanding of our lowest level of stimulation that we can actually perceive. And they consider it being perceived at a detection rate of 50% or more. So if I were to put a really, really small light in a dark room, if you noticed it was there, then you can perceive that thing. But if I make it smaller and smaller and smaller until you're really not quite sure it's there or not, that's what we consider your absolute threshold. So you're essentially guessing at a 50% rate. That's your threshold. And it's actually kind of interesting to see how good our bodies are detecting these different energies within ideal conditions. So I want you guys to watch the video on the YouTube playlist called How Old Are Your Ears? And this is going to kind of go through an auditory absolute threshold, and you can kind of see what pitches your ears can still perceive. Now, I recommend doing this in a quiet space with decent headphones on. Put your volume up maybe halfway or a little bit more. It'll start off talking and then you can hear the different pitches. It's really interesting, and it's going to talk about essentially how ears, as they get older, because they're experiencing accumulated damage throughout our lives, actually become less able to perceive high-pitched noises, again, because the damage has accrued and it makes it harder for our ears to hear these higher pitches. I want you guys to check it out, see how your ears are, and we'll talk about this quite a bit more when we get to our auditory section of this chapter. So if you look at the absolute thresholds for our 5 major senses, we have vision. So this is essentially the realistic equivalent of what the absolute threshold is. So our eyes can see, if you have good vision, a candle flame from 30 miles away. That's amazing. 30 miles is really impressive. So that's assuming, perfectly clear skies and, you have good vision and it's perfectly pitch black, things like that. Now, obviously, no one's ever testing this with an actual candle walking 30 miles away from another person and asking them, can you still see this? They do this with like pixels in a dark room. And they've scaled it up to the distance or the size of a candle flame from 30 miles. For our hearing, we can hear a mosquito buzzing from about 10 feet away. Smell is 1 drop of perfume in a 6-room apartment. Taste is 1 teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water. That's not a whole lot. And then for touch, it's the wing of a fly falling on your cheek from about a distance of 1 centimeter. And again, this is detection 50% of the time under ideal circumstances. And again, this isn't the way they test it is these things, but this is like the equivalency in a more realistic sense. If I said, how many micron weight to distance, touch, it would make no difference, or how many pixels at a distance. But it's kind of neat to see how these have essentially been equated to more real world instances. So if you may have heard of subliminal messaging or subliminal advertising before, there's been quite a bit of research on this, especially in the past. They thought that, so subliminal messages are essentially, advertisers could show you something either in a really strange way, like flashing an image to you or words to you so quickly, like 1 frame in a movie, it would make your brain go like, oh, I need to go buy some Coca-Cola. Or possibly if you play a song backwards, it'll give you satanic messages. You probably have heard of those things before. So subliminal messaging or subliminal advertising is the supposed belief that we can change someone's thought process by giving them something that's below their awareness. So they're not consciously aware of this occurring, but their brain is somehow picking this up subliminally or unconsciously, and we can change people's behavior. So I want you to kind of think about whether you believe that this is actually something that can be done or not. So a researcher who was interested in this in the 1960s decided to try to use its subliminal messages to entice moviegoers to buy more popcorn and soda without them knowing about it. And he reported that concession sales at the movie theater rose by 18%. So he said originally that it was true. And the way he did this, it really wasn't truly subliminal messaging. He would show them a preview of a desert, and people would, because deserts are dry, they would go buy more soda. I forget what they did for popcorn to make them buy more popcorn. It was something like, I don't know, I think it was like showing someone being hungry, and they were like, oh, I'm hungry too. So they went out and bought more popcorn. But in 1962, Vickrey attempted again, and he later admitted that he had not really conducted a true experiment. His sample size was small. All the newer research kind of shows that subliminal messaging is unconvincing, and they're pretty sure that subliminal messaging is not really a thing. Some studies do suggest that when certain criteria can be met, we can do what's called subliminal persuasion. So there are some interesting studies where they'll show, like, if you're at a grocery store and they're playing Italian music, you're more likely to buy Italian wine over French wine. But if they're playing French music, you're more likely to buy the French wine. But again, you perceive the music, even though you may not recognize that that's influencing your purchasing decisions. Advertisers do this all the time. If you watch a movie and you see a logo for a computer brand or a watch or a car, like, it's not accidental that that car brand was used in that movie. Or if you see Coca-Cola on a table, like, someone paid to have that there. That's not just a director's choice. Like they're getting paid to have that there. I think one of the movies that's the worst about this is the Transformers series. Like every single thing. You see Sony, you see Chevy, you see Rolex, you see Coke. They're crazy with their advertising. This is actually one of the only ways that cigarette companies, tobacco companies, can still essentially advertise their products to the youth. So in the 1990s, they made it illegal to have ads in certain magazines or on TV for tobacco products. And when they did that, the tobacco companies began paying actors and directors to include cigarette smoking, especially certain brands of cigarettes, in their movies. And so while the rate of cigarette smoking in the United States is about 20%, in movies it's closer to 50% with smoking. And so it's a much higher instance of smoking. And even like big actors and actresses like Julia Roberts, like she smokes in several movies and she doesn't smoke in real life, but they're paid in order to show off these products. So that would be kind of that subliminal messaging. So you're not aware that it's something that is occurring, but it definitely may persuade people to use or purchase certain products. So, sensory adaptation. Have you ever walked by someone and gotten like slapped in their face by their cologne or perfume, but they don't notice it? Or you get in someone's car and it just like smells like, musty socks and old like fast food bags and stuff like that. They don't notice it. Essentially being nose blind, if you've seen those commercials for Febreze. This is called sensory adaptation. This is a decrease in our sensory response to an unchanging stimulus. So over time, our sensory receptors, such as for smell, they send fewer and fewer nerve impulses back into the brain until the odor is no longer detectable. And the same thing can happen from the pressure of a watch, ring, or glasses. So if you get new glasses and you put them on, they probably feel like really awkward and heavy, but then within 20 minutes or so, you don't notice them. Same thing with a new watch or a ring, probably feels kind of awkward and heavy or maybe tight, but then as you wear it, you don't even notice it anymore. So sensory adaptation has occurred. Same thing can happen visually, auditorily, a beeping noise or like a high pitched ringing. You actually kind of begin to ignore that over time because your brain's just like, okay, this is unchanging. We're not going to need to know this anymore. We've already like dealt with it. And your brain actually stops responding to that. And that's that adaptation that occurs. So interesting thing though, kind of a nice case study is manatees. So you guys know that manatees have been endangered in the United States, especially here in Florida. This is their main habitat for 100 years. They're actually doing pretty well. Now I think they took them off the endangered species list. But manatees actually have really poor sensitivity to low frequency sounds, and the low frequency sounds are what slow moving boats make. But do you guys know what the rule is for boats when they're in an area where manatees are likely? They can't go fast. They have to go really slowly. They go in no wake. So they're going really slowly so that the manatees can hear them, move out of the way, and also boaters can see manatees and avoid them. But because the manatees can't hear the low frequency sounds, manatees have actually been killed in alarmingly high rates. So again, they have poor sensitivity to the low frequency sounds that are made by these slow moving boats. So because the current laws tell boats to slow down in manatee habitats, we actually could be increasing the risk to manatees. So it's actually kind of interesting. So if you guys have any ways to fix that, maybe some sort of device to put on a boat that will make it a high-pitched sound underneath the water, let the FWC know. You might get a nice patent and have a required device on all boats. Make some money that way. I want you guys to think about other animals that have heightened sensitivity compared to humans. So you're probably thinking maybe dogs have better smell and hearing, cats, especially hearing, they have really good ears. Dogs can sniff bombs and detect diabetes and cancer and drugs and things like that. Dolphins, they can echolocate, same thing with bats. A lot of other animals can hear sounds that we actually don't even perceive because they're above or below our threshold. It's pretty interesting. So there's a lot of animals that have abilities that we don't have. Even visually, a lot of animals have better eyes than we do, or they can see different colors than we can. And I'm going to talk about that in a few slides. So difference thresholds and what's known as Weber's law. So if you were a weightlifter, can you perceive the difference between lighter and heavier weights? Probably depending on what the weight is. So if you were to pick up a 5-pound dumbbell in one hand and a 10-pound dumbbell in the other hand, you can easily tell the difference. There's a 100% increase between 5 and 10 pounds. But if you were, say, leg pressing 400 pounds and then 405 pounds, can you feel that difference? It's still a 5-pound difference between 5 and 10 and 400 and 405 pounds. But because the ratio is much smaller in the 400 to 405 pounds, you're unlikely to actually feel that difference. Same thing happens in changes in loudness. If you're at a library and someone just starts talking, you're going to really notice that. You're going to be like, what the heck's that person doing? You're going to look at them because you're starting off at a low level of intensity. But if you're at a concert or a really loud party, another person talking isn't going to be noticed because the range has not changed a whole lot. You're not going to notice that because you're already starting at a very high intensity. So that's what's considered as Weber's law. Is it has to do more with the ratio of change than it actually has to do with the sheer amount of change. Signal detection is the way that we look at what we call sensory thresholds. So a lot of times when we're making a decision of whether we perceive something or not, there is some degree of uncertainty. So we use this cognitive process of decision making. So imagine you're a doctor and you're looking at a woman's mammogram scan and you're looking to see if she has a tumor or not in her breast tissue. So if the patient actually does physically have a tumor there, and when you looked at her exam, you thought, yes, this patient has a tumor, this is what we consider a hit. But if the person does have a tumor and you didn't think that tissue had a tumor in it, you have missed that tumor and they've missed the chance for treatment. If the patient does not have a tumor, but you think that dot is a tumor, then it's what's called a false alarm. And so maybe you sent that person for additional testing, a biopsy, surgery, kind of freaked them out a bit. But at least they got treatment and then they were told eventually that they had no tumor. Now, if the person does not have a tumor and you look at their breast tissue and you say, no, there's no tumor there, you've made what's called a correct rejection. So this hit, miss, false alarm, and correct rejection is essentially our cognitive process of making decisions. And we do this throughout our lives quite often. It just maybe isn't quite so life or death as detecting tumors. Another cool thing is that scientists are creating what they call sensory prosthetics. So they're actually creating devices that communicate from the outside world using, computer technology into our brain. So in this case, we have an artificial visual system, and we have a video camera on a pair of glasses that translates light into electrical impulses that directly stimulate the visual cortex. And that person can now get a rudimentary visual experience. So the camera here picks up the letter that they're seeing, and that goes back into the brain, or there's like a little input, and then there's a little electrode that actually kind of does little electrical impulses, like little shocks, onto the surface of the brain that are in the H formation. And eventually the brain, because it learns and adapts and is very plastic, can eventually detect that there was a letter H that this person just saw visually. Now, this is a pretty rudimentary example. They're quite a bit better than this. Maybe not for visual input, but definitely for prosthetic limbs. They've been able to get the brain to communicate with prosthetic limbs in pretty good dexterity. They can grab onto something, they can pick it up, they can hold it without crushing it. So imagine like a styrofoam cup. Like if you hold that too tightly, you're going to crush the cup and you're going to spill your drink. But if you hold it too lightly, it'll slip through the hand. So you have to have really good feedback to the brain to know how hard to hold on to something. They're getting really good with these types of things, which is really impressive. And so hopefully in the future, if a person has a problem with, say, like their optic nerve or, other parts of damage to their eye, we might be able to bypass that system and input information directly onto their brain, which is really, really cool. Sensory analysis is our separation of sensory information into important elements. So we're going to notice certain things that are basic features first. So perceptual features are basic elements of a stimulus. It could be a line, shape, edge, color, directionality. So if you look at the image on the right, you're probably going to pick out this shape first, because all the rest of these are pretty much, they're all identical. This one has a different directionality to it, and it's going to stand out to us. So when we look at sensory analysis, these are the things that are really going to pop, and these are the important elements that we are actually going to focus on. And this is a really, really cool study. There's a video about this on the YouTube channel that I hope you check out. So Blakemore and Cooper in 1970 did a study where they raised kittens in a room that essentially was like a cylinder with their mom, and then it was pitch black, and then for about an hour or two a day, they took the kittens out and they put them into a space that either had only vertical or horizontal stripes on the wall. So again, it was like a cylindrical tube, and so they all either saw vertical lines going up and down or horizontal lines, so like stripes going on the walls. If you put the cats who had been in the horizontal room, they could easily jump up onto chairs in the real world, but then they would bump into the chair legs because they couldn't detect the vertical structure of chair legs. The vertical cats would avoid the chair legs, but then they missed trying to jump onto a horizontal surface. Like they couldn't see it existed. So based on their sensitivity to the perceptual features, we realized that the early experiences in life actually changed the way that their brain perceived these basic features. Please go check out the video. You can skip through parts of it. It's a little long, but it's really cool to see these little kittens in these little sensory tubes with vertical and horizontal stripes. And then they show like trying to play with the cat or trying to put it onto a surface, and they either like can't or can't see it depending on the experience that they had initially visually. It's really impressive to see how much, we think our brain is so built for our environment, but without certain experience, our brains can't detect certain things. And that's what this study really shows. So these things that are otherwise natural inputs, we believe, are actually really based on experience. So again, that nurture side of that nature-nurture debate is quite impressive. So attention is a link between our ability to sense something and our ability to perceive something and the experiences of our environment. So attention helps direct our sensory systems towards certain stimuli. It helps us select information for further processing. It allocates our mental energy needed for that processing, and it regulates the flow of resources needed to perform tasks and coordinate several other tasks. So if you're listening to my lecture, hopefully your attention is directing you towards the stimuli. But say there's a knock on the door, then your brain will hopefully select that information for further processing. So it's going to actually like pick that up. It's going to allocate the mental energy needed for that processing. So it's going to like send resources to your ear to pick up that new sound, as well as maybe like turn your head to look at the door. And then it helps regulate the flow of resources needed to perform tasks and coordinate several other tasks. So recognizing that person's face at the door, getting up and answering the door, it's all part of that regulation process. But sometimes we can be so focused on one thing that we miss other important information. So I want you to watch the selection attention videos that are in the playlist, and hopefully you'll find some fun stuff. So I want you to watch the basketball game video, as well as the brain games videos that I'm going to link below. So oftentimes, though, our attention gets divided, which is called multitasking. We think we're good multitaskers, so we will be holding on a text conversation while we're writing a paper. We'll be talking to our friends while we're watching a YouTube video. Maybe you're walking down the hallway chewing gum. Yeah, maybe you can do that. But turns out we're really not as good at multitasking as we like to think. So if you're talking on any sort of phone, including hands-free models, it can create what's called inattentional blindness and divided attention that impairs driving and can contribute to accidents. You probably already know that. You're not supposed to text and drive, but even calling and driving can be disruptive. So when you're faced with multiple stimuli, we often try to process multiple sources of information at the same time. So especially things like driving, there's a lot of information that's coming to our brains all at once. And then if we turn our attention to our phones for any reason, whether it's, check the GPS, change the music, or talk to someone, our brains are essentially blocking out that other important information. So we can be so focused on texting that we miss an oncoming car or a kid running across the road or someone changing lanes in front of us. And it's extremely dangerous. And I think you guys know that, but there's a lot of research to back up the fact that we are really not good at multitasking. Even when it comes to task switching, so you're writing a paper, someone messages you, you answer the message, you go back to the paper. They say it takes on average 2 to 5 minutes for your brain to get back into your initial task. And so as you're working your paper, you're really slowing down process by skipping back and forth. Because if you're holding a text message conversation, you're probably answering a message every 30 seconds to 3 minutes, and you're never really getting your brain back into the initial task of writing that paper thoroughly, because you're always breaking that stream of consciousness, and that's really detrimental to progress. So take that information as you will, and hopefully you can use that. All right, so that was the end of our first section. We're going to be talking about vision in the next section of this lecture.